We've been swallowed by our houses is an embroidered tablecloth embroidered with arabani, which is this type of embroidery that we are very familiar with in Lebanon, even though it's a Syrian technique. The dimensions that I chose for this work, this tablecloth, were the dimensions of the table, of the dining table in my former apartment in Beirut, which I left after the blast. It has the shape of an embroidered tablecloth, but it's not exhibited that way. It's exhibited either in space or on the wall, vertically, and here it becomes a kind of portrait or a self-portrait as well. What is embroidered is here also, it's not the usual ornaments, it's the map, the plan of that same apartment, which the table was in. So it's a work that I made during the first lockdown in 2020. Initially, despite the terrible situation all around, despite the fact that people were getting sick and dying, for the ones who had the luxury to be confined, we all of a sudden had a lot of time. It was kind of a break in the rhythm that we were in before that period. So a very quick rhythm where we were constantly traveling. All of a sudden we had an excess of time. So it's I took advantage of the success of time to map the whole house, to take the dimensions of each room and to draw a plan of that apartment that I was locked in. I then decided to turn it into a labyrinth, a human scale labyrinth, meaning that it was drawn using an architecture software. And if it was to be built, it could be navigated inside that same house, which I left and never went back to. The reason why I decided to do this was I was working, of course, not the same way that I was working before, because we couldn't have access to any shops in order to buy material. I couldn't have access to the people that I usually work with. So this whole lockdown, also the revolution that came before in Lebanon, it created a kind of shift somehow in practices, a kind of break in the practices themselves. That was my feeling. And our perception of space and time was all of a sudden very different, and it's something that I naturally explored. My perception was that there was nothing left to do in the city because all the doors were shut. We couldn't go to relatives, to friends, to museums, to exhibitions, to whatever place. So it's as if the map of the city had become completely empty, completely bare. Like in parallel to that, the inside spaces densified extremely. And that's where the idea of the labyrinth came from. That I felt that we had been, and that's where the title came from, we had been swallowed by our houses. We had not been spit back out. We maybe still haven't. And it's as if we could get lost in the spaces that is the most familiar to us, the house. Because we were not able to find the exit out of that space anymore. So of course, these ideas refer to myth, to legends, to biblical, also Islamic, all the monotheist religions have the story of Jonas and the whale, for example. So Jonas being swallowed, inhabiting the stomach or the belly of the whale and then being spit back out. What is very interesting is that when I was making a research about it, you have a lot of miniature, for example, or enluminure, illustrating that story. And it's always from one point of view. So it's either Jonas being swallowed or Jonas being spat out. And it's very different point of views, of course. You then, much later on, have, for example, the story of Pinocchio, that's also swallowed. And it was exploring as well the idea of pregnancy, so the house being pregnant from us, but a kind of pregnancy in reverse, because it's a pregnancy where you are swallowed. It's not the usual way to be pregnant, and I was at this time pregnant as well. So I was confining myself, but in a very beautiful way, and I was confined in a somehow less beautiful way. So choosing the technique of Arabani came also from a research about stitches, about embroidery. And the Arabani technique has two qualities. It's that the stitch itself is a chain stitch. So the chain, of course, being somehow locked in. And it's also a stitch that is a spiral, that has the shape of a spiral. So it's little spirals that end up forming the overall design. And that was also very meaningful, because the idea of the spiral, of not being able to exit, really echoed the meaning of the work itself, and a show that I was curating at that time that was taking as a departure point the game of Goose, which is a spiraling path, which, the only purpose is to exit this path. There's no other purpose than to exit, and there are many obstacles to that. It's a work that I conceived during the lockdown, that I realized still during the pandemic, and that I showed for the first time still during the pandemic, but after the Beirut blast. First of all, the reason why I could find craftswomen to realize these embroideries in Lebanon was because of the presence of Syrian refugees, because it's a Syrian technique in Lebanon, so because of the war in Syria. So I was working during the pandemic, during the lockdown, on the concept of home, which all of a sudden had become extremely heavy because we were forced to stay home with these women who had lost their homes. It was very paradoxical. But by the time I showed the work for the first time, I was in the same situation as these women, as my apartment in Beirut, which was in Marem Khail, very close to the port, had been hit by the blast, and I had to leave it and to even leave the country because of that. And of course, the concept of home had changed again for the Lebanese, and it was not anymore heavy. It had become again a kind of utopia, that something to long for, because many people had lost it. There was a massive exodus that is still ongoing after the Beirut blast of the 4th of August. I think today it's impossible to read the work without going through these layers and these new filters.